fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. All my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click the subscribe button, everybody. This is an amazing episode because Dan Woodard returns to the mothership to discuss his new series, Loki, from Marvel Comics. Come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Woodard. Thank you for coming back to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Thanks very much for having me back.
So my pleasure. Like I said, you're always welcome on the show, and it's always good to have a guest who wants to come back. So, you worked recently for Azrael for DC comic books, and now you're doing Loki for Marvel. So, is there any significant difference between writing for the two companies?
Um, I mean, there are definitely differences between the universes and how they sort of like treat their history, but I mean, it's always the character that I'm focused on. It's always wanting to dig into who I've got my hands on at that particular moment. So that's always the favorite bit. I mean, it's very fun to be able to sort of like, dig into things that I read as a kid and sort of like expand on things.
So, as I said, you're writing for Marvel's Loki, and Loki has been a character in Marvel that's been around for, I believe, about 60 years. So, how do you
Mhm.
determine which continuity aspects to honor and which to cast aside?
Um, I think particularly with Marvel, it's never about casting aside so much as trying to sort of add to the tapestry. I mean, Loki's a relatively simple one with that sort of dilemma in that he uh it's inbuilt into the character to be
Hmm.
mercurial, to be sort of different day by day, and to sort of go with his whims and to sort of, shift into whatever they sort of feel like being at any particular time. So there's a character who has this depth of contradiction, both in terms of story and himself. And I think that's also what has made him so lasting and has made him so sort of like interesting to people and has made him such a breakout character over particularly the last like couple of decades. Is because he contains multitudes and he contains contradictions, and that feels more like us than anything else.
So, I mean, one word that gets tossed around a lot, with especially new series, is the term editorial mandate. So, were there any editorial mandates in writing Loki that Marvel said, I want you to make sure you're focusing on this story, or make sure we don't include this piece of information?
Not so much. What I did want to make sure was that I was sort of um fitting my piece in a way that allowed me to do what I wanted to do, but also that fit with what was to come with the character and what had sort of recently been done, because such interesting things have been done with it recently. So I did have a chat or a couple of chats with Al Ewing about his plans for Thor, his plans for Loki and Thor, and to sort of flesh out some thoughts I had on what he'd done with the character and in Agent of Asgard, what he'd done with him in Defenders Beyond. So I just really wanted to make sure it sort of lined up with that stuff, but you can do that while still finding plenty of space to play and plenty of space to sort of have this be my Loki, I guess.
Is it ever stifling to have parameters put on what you can tell? In other words, as you said, like another writer is doing this with the character, or going to do that with the character, or with the surrounding
Mm.
characters, and say you can't go here, or be careful of stepping on those toes. Does that make things more difficult, or does it help to have a focus saying this is where I need to be?
I mean, it definitely could be. Like I can see situations in which you can sort of get stuck into um a version of something or being asked to do a version of something that doesn't appeal to you. But I very much would try and avoid ever ending up in a situation like that. It doesn't. I don't think it should feel stifling. That might be a matter of perspective, because I guess I think of it in terms of, okay, but if you were telling a story about someone who was real or something that was actually happening, which is how you've kind of got to think about these things when you're making them. Um, their history, their past, and the things they have done, the things they haven't done. That's all part of it. That's all part of who makes them who they are. So you're looking at that stuff and you're not going like, oh, I wish this hadn't happened, or I wish XYZ had happened. That you're thinking, okay, this is who they are, this is where they're at, this is the experiences they've had. How has that made them who they are, and who are they now, and where is that going to take us next?
So when you're writing for Loki, and I know as I do some writing myself, and I know what writers say, you can like hear the character's voice in your head. So when you're hearing the character's voice in
Hmm.
your head, whose version or whose voice are you hearing in your head? Is it your own take? Is it a Loki from a past particular writer? You said you kind of like hear how it works, or some other form.
Yeah, I think it has to be my version. It has to be it has to be a mishmash of everything that's kind of come before. It's about finding that character's voice, and that's always going to be an amalgamation of again, like it's an amalgamation of what came before. That said, uh, I remember really dissecting Kieran Gillen's journey into mystery when I was
Mm.
first sort of thinking about wanting to write comics, because I thought that book was so smart and it played so many sort of like tricks without ever sort of like losing you, or becoming too Byzantine, or sort of twisting it, sort of getting lost in itself. So I thought that was such a cool book. So I remember sort of really digging into that and trying to sort of um, reverse engineer what Kieran was doing with that, which is also something that makes it very nice to now be handed the reins to Loki. That feels, because Loki was always the lead of that book. So it feels very nice. It feels kind of full circle to be handed the reins to it now. But that was also a very different version of Loki. That was Kid Loki. He was in a very different place. So I think that's definitely a big part of the DNA of how I would approach Loki. But it's also, it comes from other places. It comes from I love going back to the myths. We're doing that a fair bit in this book. I love going back to the original, the sort of Kirby stuff. Um, so that's all in there as well. And there's always inevitably sort of like little bits of my own experiences and writing Lucifer and stuff. Having sort of written a trickster-ish character for 2 years definitely influences how I do it now, or how I come to it now. So yeah, it's I think if I thought too hard about that question, and whose voice it was, I'd end up in danger of losing it. So,
And by the way, for any listeners who don't know, you need to check out your Dan Waters' version of Lucifer. It was a great
mm,
series. So thank you for
thanks so
producing
much.
that.
Very proud of that book.
It really was fantastic. And I think the cool thing with Loki, and I mean, and the same with Lucifer, I mean, you're talking about characters who are larger than life. I mean, we talk
Hmm.
about Loki being 60 years old, but that's Marvel Loki. The real Loki is, I don't know, a couple of thousand, maybe older than,
Yeah, a few
than
thousand.
that.
Yeah.
Than that. And in the first issue, you kind of touch on the Norse mythology with Loki's ship. We
Hmm.
have the name wrong, Nalgafar.
Yeah, I guess.
It's good enough. You just like, you know what? Just go with the spelling. How do you say it?
I say Nagelfar.
Nalgafar.
One of my closest friends is Norwegian, and I haven't ever said it in front of him because I'm scared of how he would look at me.
So where in the world did you find the tale of the Naglfar?
I mean, that's in the Eddas, that's in the prose Edda. So
Yeah.
it's in the oh god, I mispronounced his name. Is Snorri Stapleson, the sort of early Christian writer, who is the sort of surviving source we have for um a lot of the Norse myths, which is also sort of slightly strange retelling because he's kind of trying to not fit it into Christian mythology, but kind of sort of trying to go like, oh, this is all wrong, but this is what they believe. Um, so yeah, I love finding those sort of particularly weird, or sort of unusual bits, um, and sort of like really just running with them. So the Nagelfar is something that sort of lives in my head quite often anyway. Like I think about it. It's so great. It's a
it,
ship made out of dead men's fingernails.
it's one of the weirdest. When I read the story, I was like, that is so absolutely weird. And I can't remember. There's the one recently that the comic book series that Neil Gaiman did with. can't remember, last time I think it was like Carol, something like that, who kind of covered some of the Norse mythology stories.
Mm.
And the one thing I'm true about them, they are so damn weird. And I think the cool thing that you did with the Naglfar in the first issue is that you took this extremely weird thing and made it kind of make sense in a real comic book way. And I think that was, because I mean, you kind of buy into it completely. You're like, no matter how weird of a concept that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the joy. That's what I like about writing into these universes to begin with, is that you're already coming into a universe where Doctor Strange and Iron Man can be on the same team, and one's a wizard and one's a robot man. He's not a robot man, but he's a man with robots, and uh, they're coming from entirely different places in sort of sci-fi and fantasy, and they already work together, and as in the concepts work together. We buy into it as immediately when you pick up an issue. You don't need to sort of explain all of this sort of stuff, so it makes it easy to sort of bring in other ideas and just run with them.
So, in preparing for the Loki series, how deep of a dive did you do into the Norse mythology?
Um, I was already kind of in that space. I was working on a few things. Like there was sort of a few months where I was like working almost, and I don't know how this happened, but I was working almost exclusively on sort of Norse or Germanic sort of themed comics. Um, some that are career owned, some that I was asked to do. And I wasn't quite sure how that happened, but it was economic research wise at least. Like I was able to sort of dig into all that stuff at once and sort of pull different parts of it. So yeah, I love that stuff anyway. I love the sort of retellings. Gaiman's retelling was great. The Norse mythology book he did. I read that relatively recently too. So it was nice to have all those sort of like refreshers. Oh,
It, it,
I did get to go to Norway and sort of go around the museums, the sort of I can't remember the names of the museums now, but I was last summer I was sort of wandering around Norway looking at bent swords and old coins and things. So that was pretty useful.
did that get to be written off as a business expense?
Yeah, yeah, I wish I was there for a wedding. So
Oh, you'd be like, well, it's for the comic book too, so write it off.
yeah, yeah.
Go for it. It does it amaze you just how similar to comic book superheroes Norse mythology does get to?
Oh, I mean, they're different beasts. They're different sort of um, definitely like very different styles of storytelling. But I guess like anything fantastical, it all ends up coming back to the same sort of roots, and I think that's why it's ended up becoming such a big uh, cultural phenomenon. Is that this kind of strange fantasy? If you put it that way, like it's kind of how we started telling stories in the first place. The sort of comic book weirdness is yeah, there is that. It does intrinsically come from mythology. You can also see it in fairy tales. Three Little Pigs feels like Howard the Duck.
So the art for the series is completed by German Peralta. So what do you love about his work and how did this partnership come together?
I mean, we were paired together on this book, but I couldn't be happier about it. And like it gets what I'm going for so quickly. It's such a seamless collaboration. And I'm asking him to do like some tricky stuff in certain places. There's some sort of formalist trickery that we're getting up to. Um, but yeah, sometimes you work with people and it's a little more. You have to sort of it's like sort of dancing or dating. Like you have to sort of figure each other out and learn each other's beats and what each other strengths are and try and like play to that. Particularly as a writer, that's your job is to try and give the artist the things that they'll excel at. But Loki has been, I sort of I write a page and then it just appears almost as it was in my head, but generally like a fair bit better. I can't say enough good things about working with Herman. It's been a dream.
So as the writer, how much information for panels and descriptions are you giving to him, and how much are you letting him kind of just fly?
Oof. It's always tricky. It definitely varies from book to book and artist to artist, and quite often with these kind of things, you don't know who's drawing it before you start. I used to be very sort of um, specific about everything, uh, and I've definitely like loosened up with that in general, because that's part of the experience is learning what information you need to give artists, what information you don't need to sort of lock them into a specific vision or something. Let them have, give them the space to do their thing. Um, so with something like this, it probably started out more specific in issue one when I didn't know who was drawing it, and as the scripts go on, they get a little shorter because you definitely learn to trust each other. And
Hmm.
uh, I know if I give Herman like sort of a vague idea of a location and things, he'll fit it in. He'll create something that fits the mood he wants to draw.
And the other thing that's kind of interesting about Loki is that once again, it's a long history as a villain and trickster. So, how difficult is to make the villain and trickster into a protagonist?
No, it's easy.
Easy.
It's the easiest thing in the world. No, we love them. We love reading about them. We love watching them. Half the things on TV are about horrible people. We love seeing people get away with stuff. We love seeing people up to no good. Yeah, I love doing it. I loved writing Lucifer. I love writing Loki.
So, with a character like Loki, who is as we said, a trickster, can be a villain and also a god. How do you make audiences empathize or even identify with a character like that?
Um, I think it's again, it's very easy. There's a lot of wish fulfillment in a bad guy. We want to see someone getting away with stuff. We want to see someone doing all the bad things we wish we could do without consequences. Not that Loki tends to do them without consequences. He tends to make a mess and then have to fix it, which is also goes right back to the myths. That was always the Loki story. Um, but I don't think we look at there's a sort of thing about trying to make characters likable. I don't think likable always means what people think it does. It doesn't mean someone who's nice and doing nice things to people. It means someone that we can sort of understand, that we can understand their motivations, we can understand where they're coming from. And that's what we tend to get with Loki. Um, the only kind of like villain I think would be hard to write would be like they made that show recently about Dharma,
Oh yeah, Jeffrey
and
Dahmer.
that's a strange choice for a protagonist. Someone real who did some like things that evil. Um, Even if you can pick up, sort of why he did them and where that was coming from. Um, that's never going to be
you,
empathetic.
you know what's actually crazy about that? I had interviewed one of the actors from the show, Michael Learned, or whatever. I can't remember exactly how you pronounce the last name. So, as promoting it, I joined some Jeffrey Dahmer Facebooks that were part of the show, and I, to promote the episode. And I was thinking it'd be just like biographical stuff, but they're like, I love Jeffrey Dahmer chat rooms out there, and that's fucking scary as all
But,
hell. That's like, I read
yeah,
that, I was
but there
like,
you
what is
go.
wrong with you people? And it wasn't just like it was a group of 500. This is like a group of like 1,000 individuals. I mean, it was insane.
There you go. Like, yeah. So if people are doing that, it's pretty easy to make people like Loki.
I guess yes. On a level of Dahmer versus Loki, I do guess Loki
Yeah.
is the preferable character.
Yeah.
So well, as we kind of alluded to, Thor is always directly connected with Loki in Marvel. I mean, and in history, I mean, in mythology, right? And obviously,
Mhm.
Thor has a series that's at the moment being written by Torin Brownbeck. I'm gonna get the name wrong, and I apologize
Sorry.
to her. So how much how can connected is your Loki story to what's going on in Thor?
Um, Not so much to what Torrance doing, but like I said, like Al and I have talked quite a bit about so Al's taking over Thor for the relaunching it as Immortal Thor, which his first issue comes out the month after, so next month, because issue one's out. So that's where we're finding connective tissue.
Okay, so the other thing about Loki is that he's a very complex character, a lot of layers to the character. I always think of him as someone who's always thinking in wheels within wheels, sort of like the borrow from like the
Mhm.
Crucible, wheels with fires. So in your opinion, what motivates Loki, and how aware do you think he is of true motivations that he does have?
Well, I mean, I like what so something that came from Al's Agent of Asgard that I've definitely run with is that Loki is now God of stories, over being God of lies or God of mischief. But I also quite like that once you dig down into that, a storyteller is another kind of mischief maker and another kind of liar. So he's not changed all too much. Um, it's more about his allegiances to the story. His allegiance is to uh, being clever and making things happen and turning those wheels. I think that's what Loki's always been all about. But I also think, Loki's become this more empathetic character as time has worn on. The relationship between Loki and Thor has become less antagonistic, less, not antagonistic, but less antagonistic. They care for each other. And he also has sort of teammates. We're bringing in some of the young Avengers, in issue three in particular. So that's people. There are people that Loki cares about, and there are people that Loki very much does not care about. And his, behavior towards those different groups of people are so very different. And I think that's, all very rich character stuff, which is just makes him very easy to write and very easy to understand.
So, as you mentioned, though, he is the god of stories. So, how aware is he of his own place in the larger tale?
I think more than most characters, but I think there's also an underlying tragedy to that, I guess, in terms of Loki knows where Loki stands, but where they stand isn't necessarily always the most pleasant place. It's
Mm.
not to be loved, but it's to sort of cause chaos, and whether that is towards positive or negative ends, I guess, depends where you stand in relation to that story. There are definitely some people, some characters for whom Loki's motivations are just going to absolutely destroy them in very literal ways, as we get into the story. There are some people that benefit. So I think it's like anything in life. Like it's all very contextual, but Loki kind of sees it all and is willing to get their hands very dirty, very bloody to make it happen.
Now, kind of interesting is that having written for Lucifer, which everyone knows ties to the Sandman,
Mhm.
who's the Lord of Stories and Dreams, but connects. And we have that with Loki. So Sandman kind of views his responsibility as a Lord of Stories as kind of like custodian of them. Where does Loki
Mhm.
view his responsibilities as the Lord of Stories?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think for Loki, it's more about uh, Loki's definitely not as responsible as Dream. I think Loki's kind of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, but in a very uh, sort of measured way. Loki forces things to happen and enjoys them, and I think works on instinct a lot. I think that's an interesting thing about the characters is I think they set up these sort of dominoes to fall, uh, and they tend to fall in the ways that benefit Loki. But I don't know if Loki's always totally aware that that's what he's doing while
Mm.
he's doing it.
And and the thing about Loki, as you mentioned, he's very mercurial, and he's the king of the frost giants. How happy
Hmm.
is he to be a king? And because of his nature, is he a good king, or should he? Would he be a good? Is he going to be a good king?
I mean, I think that's definitely part of what we're getting into in the story. So I think by the end of the story, you know my like perspective on that.
And the thing with Loki too, once again, I kind of wonder, does he prefer the adventure more than the responsibility? And how readily does Loki, would he endanger either consciously or unconsciously those around him to embark on an adventure?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the sticking point with Loki and what makes Loki unpopular within within his social circles is that Loki's very ready to sort of put people in danger, put themselves in danger, um, in order to sort of set up those dominoes and to push over those dominoes. Loki's very smart, but also pretty careless.
um, all right, so a defining characteristic of someone of a good king, I imagine, is someone who does at some level care about his subjects. Does Loki give a shit at all about the frost giants?
I mean, it's a very specific question. Um, um, I mean, yes, Loki is trying to definitely trying to be a good king of Jotunheim, uh, but I think also very readily irritated by having to constantly prove himself to the Frost Giants, who see him as this little pipsqueak uh, wimp who doesn't beat things over the head with a sledgehammer, which is kind of what they want in a king.
So I think another great thing about the first issue, because I think it was really well done, is that it's the mysteries of the frost giants, and they get into kind of like the trouble because of a book that they read because Loki taught them to read. Now, is that, which is interesting,
Mhm.
because again, the god of stories, is that kind of a commentary on the power of books, or is it a commentary on the ruinous nature of Loki that kind of ruins everything he tries to touch?
uh, I mean, I think I have to leave that out there. I don't want to try and reverse engineer my own motivations too much. That's for I want to do that to everyone else. Um, but yeah, I mean, I also like I'm kind of a little hesitant to get into too much of. I don't think just because he's the god of stories, every story has to just be about storytelling. I think it's a good engine that can run underneath stories about other things.
Mm.
Um, I always think there's a fear of writers wanting to write about writing almost exclusively because it's something that by our nature we're particularly interested in. We're interested in the mechanics of it. We're interested in um, the power of it. We're interested in how all of it works and how it affects the world because that's what we do. That's our tools that we use to try and feed ourselves at the very least. Um, but that can then mean that we end up taking these tools which can be used to talk about anything. Like that's the point, is words can be used to dig into any number of difficult subjects. That's the motivation behind doing it in the first place. So I never want to get too caught up in that just becoming
Mm.
I don't want to use the message just to talk about the medium. So, yes, he's the god of stories. Yes, he's teaching the Frost Giants to read, and yes, that gets him in all sorts of trouble. But it doesn't mean that the whole thing has to be about storytelling.
So, I mean, because of the events of the two frost giants, some major events take place. How major are these events? In other words, are they going to radiate outside the Loki series, or are they going to be maintained within?
I don't know. That's definitely us for other writers to pick up and run with. if they choose. I'm always conscious again about trying to make things too big. I want to tell a story about Loki and things that affect Loki in the Loki book. Um, things are definitely, yeah. There's a ship crashes into the World Tree, so that's not exactly a small event. But I'm always wary of trying to make things too big, because I think there's a scale that can be too small and there's a scale that can be too big, and both you sort of end up flattening out, and
Mm.
things don't feel like they matter too much.
So, what can our listeners look forward to in the upcoming issues of Loki?
Oof. Death, destruction, uh, jokes, um, lots of Loki getting yelled at by superheroes and supervillains and dwarves and frost giants. Uh, and yeah, I think general Lokiness and him getting away with it.
That's awesome. Mr. Waters, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, sir. You're fantastic. And to the listeners, I
Likewise.
recommend the first issue of
Thanks for
Loki.
having me.
Totally my pleasure. Have a fantastic day, sir.
You too. Thanks, mate.